Hello, students. Welcome to this first lecture on the Gospel of John. This is one of three lectures on introductory matters, and we're going to concentrate all of our time in this lecture on the question of the authorship of the Gospel of John. You might wonder why there's even a question about the authorship of the Gospel of John. I mean, after all, it's called the Gospel of John. However, it's not quite that simple. We don't have copies of the New Testament Gospels until around the beginning of the 3rd century. And so we can't look back at copies that go back to the 2nd century or late in the 1st century and see if there's a title of the gospel that says the Gospel of John. There's a good bit of dispute about the titles of the Gospels and when they first were used in conjunction with the Gospels. There are some people who argue that the Gospels circulated without titles for quite a while and only eventually received the titles that we know them by today. So the problem is that we just don't know how far back the titles go. Now, I'm inclined to think that there are good reasons for thinking that the titles go back very early, but it can't be proven. Because we simply don't have any manuscripts of the Gospel of John or the other Gospels that go back into the 2nd century or the late 1st century that would allow us to actually look and see whether the Gospels bore the titles that they did. So we can't use the title of the Gospel of John to determine authorship. It's one consideration out of others, but it certainly means that by the 3rd century, this gospel was being circulated under that title, but it doesn't really enable us to know for sure whether it always circulated that way. So now with that said, we can get into the question of authorship, and you'll see why it's an issue. According to the 4th Gospel, that's what FG stands for here. According to the 4th Gospel, the author was the beloved disciple. That's another way of saying the disciple whom Jesus loved. If you'll turn in your New Testament to John chapter 21, verse 24, you'll see the verse that I have in mind. This is right at the end of the gospel. There's a dispute between Peter and John, or at least a discussion between Peter. Let me back up just a little bit. There was a discussion between Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. And in verse 24, the evangelist, who's referring back to the disciple whom Jesus loved, says that this is the disciple who has written these things, which most people take to be a reference to the 4th Gospel, for the entirety of the 4th Gospel. So there is a claim of authorship or a statement about authorship found actually in chapter 21. But naturally, it doesn't solve all of our questions or answer all of our questions, because we then have to turn and ask the question, who was this mysterious disciple whom Jesus loved? And from now on, I'm going to refer to him as the beloved disciple, and you'll know what I'm speaking about. So who was this beloved disciple? Apparently, according to John chapter 21-24, he's regarded as, at least in some sense, the author of this gospel. So let's begin by looking at what might be called the external evidence, that is, the evidence that comes from outside the Gospel of John. And this external evidence consists of later statements made by Christians about the identity of the beloved disciple. The problem, of course, is that we don't have any external evidence before about AD 180. And we don't know exactly when the Gospel of John was written, but if the Gospel of John was written right near the end of the first century, then this would be about 80 years later. The first testimony comes from Theophilus, who was bishop of Antioch, and somewhere around AD 181, Theophilus says that John was the beloved disciple. Right around the same time, St. Irenaeus, who was bishop of the church in Lyon, France, states that the beloved disciple was John, the disciple of the Lord. Also, from perhaps slightly later time, comes the testimony of what's called the Muratorian Canon. This is an early fragment of a Christian writing that listed, contained a list of the New Testament books that Christians were using as authoritative. Muratorian canon is often dated right around AD 200, although there is some dispute about that. But according to the Muratorian canon, the beloved disciple was John, one of the disciples of the Lord. St. Clement of Alexandria, who wrote right around the same time, that is, right at the very beginning of the 3rd century, simply refers to the beloved disciple as John. There is a very early, one of the earliest copies of the Gospel of John, earliest manuscripts, called P66. P stands for papyrus. This manuscript is the earliest Greek manuscript of the 4th Gospel with a title. And the title is The Gospel According to John. The next bit of external evidence comes from something that is called the Latin anti-Marcionite prologue to John. This was a prologue to the Gospel of John that circulated in some manuscripts, giving some basic information about the Gospel of John. The anti-Marcionite prologue is also dated right around the beginning of the 3rd century, around AD 200. And according to this prologue, the beloved disciple was John the Apostle. Now you notice that in none of the other external evidence have we had a statement that the beloved disciple was John the Apostle, only this one. I want you to bear that in mind. I'm going to bring it back up a little bit later. Most of the earliest testimonies just say John or John, the disciple of the Lord. Now, almost all later Christian writers understood this John, or John, the disciple of the Lord, as John the Apostle, the son of Zebedee. Eventually, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the book of Revelation were also attributed to John the Apostle. That's a somewhat later development, though. But eventually, in in the basic church understanding, the gospel, the epistles, and the book of Revelation were all eventually attributed to John the Apostle. Now then, after surveying the earliest and most important of the external evidence to the identity of the beloved disciple, now let's turn to the question of internal evidence. In other words, evidence that can be found within the Gospel of John. First of all, it's important to get the texts that speak about the beloved disciple out on the table in front of us. So I have a list here of all of the passages in the fourth gospel that mention the disciple whom Jesus loved. Of course, one of the surprising things, as you can look at the list here, is that there are no references prior to chapter 13. And chapter 13 in the Gospel of John pertains to the Last Supper. So right on the face of it, that's surprising that there's no reference to the beloved disciple prior to the Last Supper. Also, you will notice that there are two other texts that possibly refer to the beloved disciple, but we can't be sure for certain. These two texts refer to a disciple who is not named. In John 18:15 through 16, we read about Peter and another disciple. He's not called the beloved disciple, but since Peter is often associated with the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John, there are many people who suspect that this other disciple, mentioned in chapter 18, is also the beloved disciple. In John 19:35, there is a statement about a disciple who witnessed the events of the crucifixion. And the statement that is made about him sounds very similar to the statement in chapter 21 that's made about the beloved disciple and the truthfulness of his testimony. So therefore, we have these two passages, chapter 18 and chapter 19 here, that possibly refer to the beloved disciple, although not in so many words. So there is some debate about that. Now, let's just make some observations based on these texts. The first one I've already mentioned. The beloved disciple isn't mentioned until the Last Supper. Secondly, the beloved disciple was present at the Last Supper. He might have been present also in Gethsemane, but that all depends upon whether the other disciple is really the beloved disciple. But he definitely was present at the Last Supper, and not only that, but he has a place of prominence as he is propped up against Jesus's chest. That's the third observation. The beloved disciple was in a prominent seat at the Last Supper. Also, the beloved disciple was present at the crucifixion of Jesus. That's surprising because according to the Synoptic Gospels, there's no reason to think that any of the apostles were actually present for the crucifixion. The fifth observation is that on the cross, Jesus entrusted his mother to the beloved disciple. Number 6, the beloved disciple is associated with Peter 4 times, and I've listed the text, and possibly a fifth. It all depends upon whether the other disciple mentioned in chapter 8 refers to the beloved disciple or not. Also, over a week from Easter, the beloved disciple was with 6 other disciples fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Now, this is the last basic scene in the Gospel of John, where there are 7 disciples of Jesus. They've gone back to Galilee after the resurrection. They decide to go fishing. Jesus appears to them, and the beloved disciple was one of those 7 that were mentioned there. So who was this beloved disciple? Well, we're going to look at the major options. We're not going to look at every option, but we're going to look at the ones that have garnered the most support. The traditional view is the one we'll take up first, that the beloved disciple is John the Apostle. This view, prior to about 200 years ago, was just sort of the traditional view down through church history. But a lot of modern scholars either have serious questions about this or completely reject it. But there are some recent advocates, such as Leon Morris, D.A. Carson, and Craig Blomberg, with whom I was in school at the University of Aberdeen. Now, let's look at the arguments that can be put forward that seem to favor this view. Well, the external evidence seems to favor it if the earliest testimonies that we looked at are referring to John the Apostle. So if you take the position that the earliest testimonies that we looked at earlier, when they talk about John the disciple, or they talk about simply John, if you believe that the authors, the writers were speaking about John the Apostle in those cases, then the external evidence favors this view. Also, in the Synoptic Gospels and in the book of Acts, John the Apostle is often linked with Peter. And of course, in the Gospel of John, Peter and the beloved disciples are linked together several times. So that might also be considered an argument in its favor. According to the Synoptic Gospels, John the Apostle was present at the Last Supper. And of course, in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple was present at the Last Supper. So at least that's consistent. Number 4, according to the Synoptic Gospels, John the Apostle was a fisherman. Now, that seems to harmonize with what we are told in John chapter 21. I just referred to this a moment ago. It's the story about the 7 disciples who go back to Galilee and go to the lake of Galilee and fish together. And one of those 7 was the beloved disciple. So that seems to square with the notion that John the Apostle himself was a fisherman. Doesn't prove it, but it's consistent with it. According to the Synoptic Gospels, John the Apostle was one of 3 disciples chosen by Jesus to be with him on occasion. You remember, for example, the transfiguration of Jesus. We're told that Jesus selected Peter, James, and John to go with him and to experience that event. So that also might be regarded as consistent with the way that the beloved disciple is portrayed in the Gospel of John. He's certainly portrayed as someone very close to Jesus. Also, some people make the case that John the Apostle is never mentioned in the 4th Gospel except in chapter 21, verse 2, And even there, he is not mentioned by name. There's just a reference to the sons of Zebedee, but John is not mentioned by name. Now, in the Synoptic Gospels, of course, John the Apostle is a major figure, a major player. Not only one of the 12, but he's also seemingly has an especially close relationship to Jesus. So it would be mysterious if the fourth gospel never refers to John the Apostle, because he is such a major player according to the Synoptic Gospels. But if the beloved disciple is in fact John the Apostle, then the problem is solved. That would mean John the Apostle is mentioned a number of times in the fourth gospel. He's just not mentioned by name. He's mentioned as the beloved disciple. Now, one other argument that might be made is that it's possible that the mother of John the Apostle was the sister of Saint Mary, that is, Jesus' mother. If you'll take the time, you don't need to do it right now, but if you'll take the time sometime to look at Matthew 27:56 and compare that with John 19:25, then you will see how some people suspect that the mother of the sons of Zebedee was the same person as the sister of the Virgin Mary. This, of course, would explain, or helps to explain, why Jesus might entrust his mother to the beloved disciple. So these are all arguments that that are put forward by people who try to make the case that the beloved disciple was John the Apostle. However, there are some difficulties associated with this view as well. We'll look at those now. In the Synoptic Gospels, John the Apostle is mentioned throughout the Gospel, throughout the story of Jesus, not just at the end of the story. Whereas in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple is nowhere mentioned until the Last Supper. You have to admit that's odd. Also, the Synoptic Gospels are silent about any apostles being present at the crucifixion. Now, it's an argument from silence, but at least the impression that you get from the Synoptic Gospels is that the disciples all fled at Gethsemane, and then, of course, Peter followed Jesus to the courtyard, but eventually he left there as well. So that's puzzling. If the beloved disciple is John the Apostle, then that's an interesting situation there. Also, John the Apostle isn't called by name in the fourth gospel, but there is a reference to the sons of Zebedee in chapter 21, verse 2. That would be a reference to James and John, of course. So the argument that John the Apostle is never mentioned in the Gospel of John has to be nuanced just a little bit, because actually there is at least one reference to John the Apostle, even though not by name. The Synoptic Gospels are silent about anyone going to inspect the empty tomb along with Peter. Of course, in the Gospel of John, Peter and the beloved disciple go to inspect the tomb. But in the Synoptic Gospels, Luke in particular, Peter goes to inspect the tomb, but nobody is said to have gone along with him. Another interesting issue to consider. The Synoptic Gospels are silent about anyone accompanying Peter to the courtyard of the high priest. If you read the Synoptic Gospels, you read about Peter following at a distance and finally goes to the courtyard, but nothing is said about anybody else being with him. In the Gospel of John, there is a reference to Peter going to the courtyard, but he is in company with another disciple. Now, like I said, some people think that this other disciple was the beloved disciple. If this other disciple was the beloved disciple, and he was the Apostle John, then it is odd that the Synoptic Gospels don't say anything about John the Apostle going with Peter. Now, this is an interesting one. This objection is if John the Apostle was the beloved disciple, and if the other disciple mentioned along with Peter in the courtyard was the beloved disciple, then we have a really strange situation, because the Gospel of John tells us that this other disciple who was with Peter was known by the high priest, and in fact, that's how Peter was able to get into the courtyard, is because this other disciple who was known to the high priest and who was trusted by him made it possible for the other disciple to vouch for Peter and to get him into the courtyard. So the question then becomes, if this other disciple along with Peter is the beloved disciple, and the beloved disciple is John the Apostle, then of course we know that John the Apostle was a fisherman from Galilee, which was a long ways from Jerusalem, 3 days walk. How is it that the high priest and the high priestly servants would have known this other disciple and been able to trust him? Of course, this argument it only has force if you think that the other disciple was the beloved disciple. If you deny that, then this argument doesn't necessarily have any force. So, we've looked at the first possibility being that the beloved disciple is John the Apostle, and you've seen evidence for and against that view. The second option that a few people have taken along the way is that the beloved disciple was Lazarus. The Lazarus, of course, who was featured in a long story in John chapter 11. Actually, one of the earliest people to suggest that the beloved disciple was Lazarus was the reformer Martin Luther. It has also been argued in modern times, in present day, by New Testament scholar Ben Witherington. Okay, what can be said for this view? Well, in the fourth gospel, Lazarus is said to be loved, and this word love coming from the Greek word agapao. Lazarus is said to be loved by Jesus. That's in chapter 11, verse 5. Lazarus is also said to be loved by Jesus in 3 other places in that same chapter, but a different Greek word is used, phileo. But these two terms, agapao and phileo, are more or less synonyms. So it is interesting, one has to admit, it is interesting that you have this one named character in the gospel who 4 different times is referred to as being loved by Jesus. Also, I might add that while the verb agapao is normally used to describe Jesus's attitude toward the beloved disciple, that the other word phileo is also used of the beloved disciple in chapter 20, verse 2. So some people have argued, since there are 4 different scriptures in chapter 11 where Lazarus is said to be loved by Jesus, either with the word agapao or phileo, then this is the indication that the beloved disciple is in fact Lazarus. One other bit of evidence that could be put forward is that Lazarus was from Bethany. Bethany was not up in Galilee, but was a suburb of Jerusalem. And that, of course, might explain why the beloved disciple does not show up until the Last Supper. You wouldn't expect Lazarus to have spent time up in Galilee with Jesus because he lived right there in a kind of a bedroom community, we might say, from Jerusalem. Now, what are the negatives about this view? Well, first of all, there's no ancient tradition to support it. We can't find any early Christian writers who know this view or who pass it down as a tradition. There's just simply no ancient tradition to support it, like there is the view that the beloved disciple is John the Apostle. Also, if Lazarus was the beloved disciple, then it does raise questions about why, after the resurrection, he would have traveled all the way back up to Galilee. According to John chapter 21, the beloved disciple was with Jesus in Galilee after the resurrection. He was fishing along with some other disciples of Jesus. Now, of course, it's not impossible that Lazarus might have gone to Galilee after the resurrection, but that's certainly not what you would have expected to have happened. Also, if Lazarus is the beloved disciple, it seems very odd that the 4th gospel would have, the author of the 4th gospel would have openly spoken of Lazarus by name in chapter 11, but then after that simply called him the beloved disciple. That's you've got to admit, that's a bit mysterious. If the statements that are made about Lazarus in chapter 11, if those are intended to sort of let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, as to who the beloved disciple was, then it's strange that after that, he's never called Lazarus again, but simply the beloved disciple. Also, one other thing has to be taken into consideration, if you think that the other disciple of John chapter 18 was the beloved disciple. So if you make that equation, and you may not, but if you make that equation, many people have, then why would Lazarus be known and trusted by the high priest if the chief priest had been planning to kill Lazarus, according to verses 10 and 11 of the next chapter? So that doesn't really, this is a pretty strong argument if you think that the other disciple was in fact the beloved disciple. It would not make sense that the the officials there at the palace of the high priest would have trusted Lazarus, and on the strength of his assurances would have let Peter into the court. Now, a third option as to who the beloved disciple is the option that he was a man known as John the Presbyter. The word presbyter is a Greek word, or at least it's pretty straight from a Greek word, and it's often translated elder in English. So John the Presbyter or John the Elder. Recent advocates of this view are Martin Hengel, a German New Testament scholar who recently died, and also Richard Bauckham, who teaches in Britain. Now, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about who this John the Presbyter was, because there's nobody mentioned by that name in the New Testament or in the four Gospels. This person is first attested by a Christian bishop by the name of Papias. Papias was the bishop of the church in Hierapolis, which was very near the city of Colossae. I'm sure you know about one of the letters of the New Testament that was written to the Colossian church. So Hierapolis was very close to that. So Papias was bishop of that church. He lived from somewhere around 70 AD into about the middle of the 2nd century. Now, Papias says that by the time that he was writing his book, Papias wrote a book called The Interpretation of the Sayings of the Lord. That book, unfortunately, no longer exists, but quotations from that book do exist. But according to Papias, when he was doing the work and the research on that book, he says that most of the apostles and the other eyewitnesses of Jesus's ministry were dead, including John the Apostle. But he goes on to say that there were two disciples of Jesus, or eyewitnesses of the ministry of Jesus, who were still alive, and he gives their names. Aristion, he's also not mentioned in the New Testament, Aristion and John the Presbyter. This particular fragment from the writings of Papias is found in the later book written by Saint Eusebius. So if you want to actually see what Papias said, you have to go to Eusebius's book to see it, which of course we have in the library in English translation. So the earliest person to speak specifically about this John the Presbyter or John the Elder is Papias. And according to him, he was an eyewitness of the ministry of Jesus, being a disciple of Jesus, not necessarily an apostle, but a disciple of Jesus. Now, what are the pros and cons about this view? Well, it might explain why the earliest external evidence attributes the fourth gospel to, quote, John the disciple of the Lord, rather than, quote, John the apostle, or John the son of Zebedee. It is interesting, can't really go beyond that, but it is interesting that in all of those early testimonies that we looked at a few minutes ago, only one of them says John the apostle. The rest of them either simply say John or John, a disciple of the Lord. Actually, if Papias is correct, John the Presbyter was a disciple of the Lord. This solution, the solution of John the Presbyter, avoids some of the difficulties of ascribing the fourth gospel to John the Apostle. One of these would be the fact that the beloved disciple does not appear in the story, not mentioned in the story until the Last Supper. Well, that's really pretty odd if the beloved disciple is John the Apostle. But if that disciple is somebody else, and somebody else that we don't really know anything about from the Gospels, then it might be easier to understand why he shows up only for the first time at the Last Supper. Also, it's kind of intriguing that 2nd and 3rd John, the epistles in the New Testament, 2nd and 3rd John, are very similar to the 4th Gospel in vocabulary, style, and theology. So similar, in fact, that most people think that whoever wrote the 4th Gospel also wrote the Johannine epistles. But what's interesting is that the author of 2nd John and 3rd John specifically gives his name at the beginning of these two epistles. 1st John is anonymous. There is no statement of the author in 1st John. But in 2nd and 3rd John, the author who's sending these epistles simply refers to himself as the presbyter. Now, that doesn't prove anything, but it is intriguing, especially if you think that the beloved disciple might be this character named John the Presbyter. Okay, what are the cons of this view? What are the difficulties of this view? Well, first of all, it could be argued that given the prominence of John the Apostle in the Synoptics and the book of Acts, it's really unlikely that St. Irenaeus, St. Clement, and the Muratorian canon would have been referring to someone other than the apostle when they spoke of John, the disciple of the Lord. And I think that point has some force to it. Also, Papias doesn't say anything at all about where John the Presbyter was from. He doesn't say that he was from Jerusalem or Judea. So the fact that the beloved disciple does not appear until the Last Supper, we actually just don't know anything about the origin of John the Presbyter, and so we don't know really whether his appearance, his first appearance at the Last Supper, really does fit in with the presentation of the 4th Gospel or not. We just simply don't know hardly anything about this John the Presbyter. Now, this third consideration is one that I think has a great deal of force behind it. I don't necessarily know that it proves, but I think it does have some force behind it. Is it likely that a person unnamed in the Synoptics and the book of Acts, because John the Presbyter would be someone who was unnamed in the Synoptics and Acts, is it likely that such a person would have played the central role assigned to the beloved disciple in the 4th Gospel? Remember, the beloved disciple has this very prominent position lying up against Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. Jesus also entrusts his mother to the beloved disciple. And so it's kind of hard to imagine that someone who played as central a role as the beloved disciple in the 4th Gospel would simply go unnamed in the Synoptics and in the book of Acts. Now, let's go back. Another difficulty with the view that the beloved disciple is John the presbyter is that the beloved disciple was present at the Last Supper, according to the Gospel of John. But John the presbyter, according to Papias, was not one of the 12 apostles. But that's only a difficulty if you believe that the synoptic gospels are telling us that only the 12 apostles were with Jesus at the Last Supper. Actually, I think there's pretty good evidence that while the 12 apostles were present at the Last Supper, they were not the only people who were present. And if they were not the only people who were present, then this particular view, this particular objection doesn't have very much force. Now, the last option that we're going to consider in this lecture is that the beloved disciple was a Jerusalem disciple of Jesus whose name we don't know, that he was not a member of the 12. And some fairly recent advocates of this view include Oscar Kuhlman, who's been dead for several years, Raymond Brown. Actually, all three of these were major 20th century scholars, but have died within the last few decades. Oscar Kuhlman, Raymond Brown, and G.R. Beasley Murray. Raymond Brown, I might mention something about him. He wrote a very, very important commentary on the Gospel of John back in the 60s, the 1960s. And in that commentary, he argued that the beloved disciple was John the Apostle, but he later changed his mind and came to believe that the beloved disciple was not John the Apostle, but an unknown Jerusalem disciple. Excuse me for just a moment. I think my power is beginning to run down on the computer. Let me see here. Yes. So if you would please excuse me for one moment, I'll run back and plug it in and we can finish up. I don't lack much. Okay, back again. Sorry about that. Sorry I wasted your time. All right, let's go back then to, let's see, the current slide. Okay, here we go, I think. So the fourth option is that the beloved disciple is someone whose name we don't know. A disciple of Jesus from the Jerusalem area and not a member of the 12. Sometimes he's referred to as being a more minor disciple of Jesus. Well, let's look at the arguments for. This solution also, like John the Presbyter, avoids some of the difficulties of ascribing the fourth gospel to John the Apostle. So that's one thing that it might have in its favor. It might explain why, for example, you don't you don't read about this character until the Last Supper, when Jesus is in Jerusalem instead of in Galilee. Another argument that's been put forward for this view is that the use of the term beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, rather than using a name, might indicate that the beloved disciple was not well known outside his own circle. And so some people have suggested that that is the reason why he is consistently referred to as the beloved disciple, is because he was a character who was not widely known among Christians. That argument seems to me to be rather weak. Now, what are the arguments against this view? The first one is very similar to the one that I mentioned under John the Presbyter. Is it likely that a person unnamed in the Synoptics, in the book of Acts, are not even referred to, even in any way, would have played the central role assigned to the beloved disciple in the fourth gospel? Is it possible that there's a disciple who's so minor that he doesn't show up at all in the Synoptic Gospels in the book of Acts, and yet he seems to be such a prominent figure in the Gospel of John? And then one other argument against this view is that if he was a Jerusalem disciple, then why would he have gone to Galilee after the resurrection? Why would he have been up there among those other disciples who decided to go fishing on the Sea of Galilee? Again, it's not impossible that that would happen, but it doesn't seem likely. So what we've done today is we have looked at 4 different possibilities as to who the beloved disciple might be. And as you can see, there are arguments for and against all 4 of them. I think that the question of the identity of the beloved disciple is a mystery. It's a great sort of mystery that if you have detective interest in your veins, then this is a very interesting kind of question, because you got different options. Each one of them have certain things favoring them, certain things against them. But one thing is for sure, regardless of exactly who the beloved disciple was, he was, by the time of the beginning of the 3rd century, he was definitely understood to be a John, and probably understood to be John the Apostle. But our problem is that we can't get back to an earlier period than that. So I just wanted you to be aware of the different issues that are involved. A lot of times in church, people just simply refer to the beloved disciple as John, as if that is obvious. But it's not obvious. The beloved disciple is never identified in the Gospel of John, and that is the reason why there have been so many discussions back and forth about who the author was. Now, the question of authorship, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in our next lecture, but a question of authorship is not really, it's a separate question from whether the Gospel of John is considered canonical, that is, authoritative, inspired scripture, and if it could be proven, for example, that the author was Lazarus or the author was this mysterious John the Presbyter, it would not make any difference in terms of the canonical authority of the Gospel of John. because its authority is not rooted specifically in the identity of the author. All four of the candidates that we've talked about in our lecture today would be people who were disciples of Jesus and therefore had direct contact with Jesus and witnessed at least some aspects of his ministry. So that needs to be kept in mind. So at this point, we'll stop, and we'll pick up at this point in our next lecture, and hope you have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.